Welcome to another wonderful Susannah Calloway audiobook. We are excited to have you with us. Before we begin the story, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. This allows us to continue adding free clean Western romance audiobooks for you to enjoy. The following title is copyrighted by Susannah Calloway, Western romance author. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and enjoy the story. The Bounty Hunter's Bride. Chapter 1. The night was cold and the ground was hard, but Caleb had long since grown used to it. The place where he and Anton were camping was good, with a town not too far away and a river nearby. They were better off than they'd been many times in the past 5 months. During the long trek to this place, they had grown used to the discomfort, anyway. It was a good life, at least to Caleb. He'd never been sheltered, never been rich, and he'd never needed more than a horse and the wind, though his poor mother would fall sick with worry if she knew the details of how he lived. He had vowed long ago never to tell her. God knew the woman would come to get him and drag him home herself. Caleb and Anton were eating some jerky and playing poker on the hard ground between their tent and the fire pit, resting for a while before they infiltrated the Cobalt brothers' camp tomorrow. The food was too salty and hard, but Caleb relished it. It had been a long road, and it would end now in El Paso, New Mexico. The Cobalt brothers were camping not too far away. Tomorrow he'd eat like a king. Still, Caleb wasn't exactly weary, but he also wasn't at ease. He couldn't stop fidgeting with his cards. Anton noticed his restlessness and gave a quiet sigh. He clasped the younger man on the shoulder. "Stop frettin', boy," he said in his gravelly voice. He didn't look up from his cards. "Everything'll go perfect. We've planned this for months, and you know I've tracked these outlaws for years now. I know what they're made of, where they're weak. And we got permission from the local sheriff and all. Ain't nothing to go wrong." "You refused the sheriff's posse," Caleb pointed out. "Seems to me that could give way to something going wrong." "What if we need them?" Anton scoffed. "Need them? Boy. It's like I taught you nothing. I refused it for a reason. We can do this, and we will do this tomorrow. Didn't I just say I know these men? You're just nervous, 'cause it's all gonna go down soon, but you need to learn to stop letting it get to your head. Be calm. We're bounty hunters, this is what we do. And it's gonna go perfect." He reached over and grabbed Caleb's arm. "Trust me, son. Now, will you stop your fidgeting with their cards? They won't last long if you keep thumbing at the corners like that." Right, Caleb said, shaking his head. He pushed his wheat blonde hair back. He felt reassured. His own father had died 2 years ago, and Anton had filled the spot like he'd been his father all along. His confidence filled Caleb with confidence in turn. "They're wanted alive, though," Anton reminded him after a moment of companionable silence. "I know you got some sharp shootin' there, had to have with me teaching you, but remember to shoot where they won't die. At least where they won't die immediately." Caleb laughed, and Anton chuckled along. "Of course, I won't," Caleb denied, mockingly affronted. He punched Anton's shoulder, who rolled his eyes. "They got several bounties on their heads, and I don't know 'bout you, but I want to sleep in a good place and eat good food for a week after we're done." I. "But won't you send some to your mother, boy? I know your father's dead." Caleb grimaced. "She's married to that Lucas Jacobs man now, so she don't need nothing from me. Even though I don't really like him, she's got a good life back in Ellsworth, Texas. She don't need me coming back." Anton frowned down at his cards, his heavy, white-streaked eyebrows low over his eyes. He looked discomfited, as if that hadn't been the point of his comment, but Caleb didn't understand what else he could have wanted him to say. "Tomorrow, we'll be rich," Caleb said, trying to cheer up the man. "And then poor again a week later," Anton completed with a grin, and the two of them laughed, the awkward moment swept aside by easy camaraderie. They got ready moments before the day dawned, and it was already sweltering hot. The brothers usually stirred at first light, and Anton and Caleb planned to catch them just as they woke. Caleb was as ready as he was ever going to be. He and Anton quickly gathered their belongings and their bedrolls and readied their bullets. The brothers weren't far, but still a fair piece from the nearest town. The brothers were hidden in the midst of a recent wreckage of wagons from a few months ago. That catastrophe was a sorry sight that the people had decided not to disturb out of respect for the dead. Anton's plan was simple. They would infiltrate the camp and catch the Cobalt brothers by surprise. They waited until a wagon passed in order to mask their approach, and then they sprinted into place. Caleb's heart hammered, but his hands were steady. If Caleb craned his neck and squinted, he could see the edges of a boot, the top of a hat, the corner of a blanket. Adrenaline coursed through his body and made him feel alive. Today, they would collect their dues. They were halfway settled in when a shot zapped past him. He lost his footing with a shout of alarm. What was happening? The shot had come from the camp, but the brothers were supposed to be asleep. Caleb steadied himself and raised his gun to shoot back, and from the corner of his eye, he saw Anton do the same. "Anton," he shouted over the loud gunshots. "What's going on?" "I don't know," Anton told him, his voice tight. If one of them was awake, then maybe he saw us, but to shoot so fast. A laugh cut the air like a blade, rasping and angry, and at once all the shooting stopped. Caleb and Anton had now moved less than 20 feet from the wagon crash, and Caleb could see the three brothers clearly. Rufus, Wesley, and Gus had the same scraggly black hair, the same beady black eyes, their mouths like jagged lines. Caleb felt disgust looking at them. They were completely dressed, perfectly awake, and armed. Caleb pinched his mouth shut. He and Anton had been expected. "Ya thought we was stupid," Rufus, the oldest and the one who had laughed, rasped again. He spit on the ground. "It's been months, and ya thought we wouldn't notice you hangin' around us like flies?" Anton's hand on his arm kept Caleb from shooting, though God forgive him, the Lord himself wouldn't be able to make him lower his aim right then and there. The Cobalt brothers were more heavily armed than the two of them. The five of them stood still, facing each other. Caleb felt dread curdle in his stomach. When a shootout froze like this, it was always bad news. There was no way this was ending without death, and he and Anton were at a disadvantage. Well, Anton said, knuckles white around his gun, though his tone of voice was bored, like he wasn't surprised at all by the trap they'd walked into. The man had nerves of steel, and despite the situation, Caleb felt respect for him. "What should we do now?" "Way things are, this'll end in a bloodbath, and I don't know about you, but I'd prefer to avoid that." They were close enough to the pile of wagons that some of the wreckage could provide cover. Caleb tilted his head to the side and saw Anton tilt his as well in agreement. They would jump for cover when the shooting began again, and they'd make it if they were fast enough. "I like bloodbaths," Wesley said in a guttural voice. Caleb bolted behind a wagon and avoided 2 shots, but not one to the shoulder. He dropped with a gasp, pain like an inferno in his body, but his aim stayed true, and before he fell, one of the brothers died with a shot to the head. Caleb clutched at his wound, his breathing haggard. He watched between pieces of old wood and a broken wheel with a hand clutching at his shoulder as another brother dropped before he could shoot him, and the third, apparently unharmed, ran too far for him to hit. Wincing and sweating from the pain, he turned to Anton, who would for sure be able to go after the criminal. They still had one brother alive to collect the bounty from. They could do this. As he turned, his urgency turned to horror. Anton was wheezing on the ground, his hand closed like a rock over a rapidly spreading dark stain on his chest. Caleb struggled to his knees and shuffled to his side, bounty forgotten, everything forgotten but his friend and teacher. Anton hadn't bolted in time. He was dying, so much so that he looked up at Caleb with misty eyes and could barely speak. "Run," he croaked out. "No," Caleb vehemently refused, leaning over his friend's body. He would not leave without him. If the last living brother saw him here and took the opportunity to shoot him, Caleb would gladly be shot, because he wouldn't leave Anton behind. His shoulder pulsed with pain. Blood flowed down his fingers. He'd never gotten shot before, and he'd underestimated the pain. Run, Anton tried again, one gnarled finger pointing at Caleb's chest. Caleb grasped his hand in his, their knuckles white with how strongly they were clutching at each other. Anton was shaking, or maybe Caleb was. Go home, to your mother. She's waiting, you can have a life, you should stop living like this. It's the life I chose, Caleb tried, but he already knew he was going to do it. He would do anything Anton asked of him now. Go home to your mother, son, Anton coughed out, the light in his blue eyes dimming. Caleb pressed a hand firmly against the wound, trying to staunch the blood, but it was already too late. Things were a blurry after that. Caleb woke up in an unfamiliar bed to an unfamiliar ceiling and his entire body ached. His right shoulder hurt with a stabbing pain that immediately brought back memories that he didn't want to think about. But the thoughts came, nevertheless. Caleb vaguely remembered being shaken awake by a Texan ranger, being carried somewhere, someone wrenching his hands away from Anton. Now he struggled to look down at his own hands. They were cleaner than he recalled, clean of blood and of the dirt of the road. He felt a surge of anger, that someone had taken this last piece of Anton from him, and gratitude, that he hadn't had to wash the blood off himself. You awake, son? Caleb turned to his side, glad to drop his hands to his sides. The man by his bedside was clearly a doctor. Barely, Caleb said, the words like sand on his dry throat. The doctor brought him some water and he gladly drank it down. Thanks, document. You gave us all quite a scare, the doctor continued in his placid voice of doctor, like that of someone who was used to violence, but still sympathetic. If Jacob hadn't found you, well, let's not think of that. You're a bounty hunter, aren't you? Some of us recognize those cutthroats dead on the road. Caleb closed his hands into fists, remembering his promise to his mentor. I was, he said with a shrug, which he regretted when the pain made itself clearly known again. I see, the doctor said, relieved. I was about to say you won't be able to go on in the same manner with that arm anymore. I'm glad you're leaving that life. Do you have somewhere to go? There are some wagons here that should be leaving soon. I got a promise that with God's help I'll keep, and a mother to make happy with my return, Caleb said with a shaky nod. Even with everything, he felt a surge of warmth in his chest at the thought of his mother. He hated what had happened to him, but he was glad he would be able to make her happy by returning. Chapter 2. My son, Eleanor said, watching from the kitchen as Caleb put his boots and his hat on. He was heading out to tend to the horses, like he often did before starting the day's chores. Are you going out without eating anything? At this hour? Sit down, son. I'm almost done with the tea. I'll be only a moment, he tried to argue, shaking his head. He had put his hat on already and wouldn't want to take it off again. But Eleanor wouldn't let her boy go out to do any heavy work without eating, not when she remembered his wound, even if it had healed already. It was no secret that his shoulder still bothered him from time to time. It took one look from her for him to take off his boots and sit down at their small table. Eleanor turned back to the tea and the bread, satisfied. Caleb had been back to their family's ranch for 5 months already, and Eleanor couldn't be happier. He helped her husband, who was not his father, and with whom he didn't get along with as much as tolerated, around the ranch, and everyone's lives were the better for it. Eleanor rejoiced in having her son by her side instead of out on the Wild West with God only knew who, doing God only knew what. His wound was enough of a hint of the life he used to lead before he came back. It was an ugly, selfish thought, but she was glad for the tragedy, because it had brought him back home to her. Yet when one worry left her, another took its place. Caleb had arrived at the age to find a wife but seemed to have no inclination to go out there and search for a good woman to bring into the family. He didn't like going into town, didn't like visiting the neighbors with her, and didn't seem to want much of anything besides riding the horses. He always avoided the subject when she tried to plead with him to take her seriously. How Eleanor tried, but there was only so much she could do to cajole him. He was a grown man. He should know life had a path to follow, and that he was at the age to go and follow it. It was only right for him to be looking for a wife and to settle down on his own place. People in town were already talking about her son, the man who had left to be a bounty hunter and came back, different. He had grown into a quiet and thoughtful man, she knew. He had seen some things that she had prayed he would never have to see. But being quiet didn't have to mean being antisocial, God forbid. There was a town out there, people to visit, neighbors with daughters he could see. The Johnsons next door had a girl with lovely brown hair and green eyes. But he refused. This all meant Eleanor was out of options, and she would be obligated to do something she had serious misgivings about. "Will we have fresh bread today?" Caleb asked, curious but distracted. "I didn't see you prepare the dough earlier." "A woman has her ways," Eleanor said proudly. "And a man stands in awe," he joked back. Eleanor's heart melted. She had missed her son, his quiet jokes, his fiery moods. He didn't often listen to her on things that were important, like getting married, but he always did his best to make her happy. He would be a good, solid husband, and Eleanor, more than anything, wanted him happy and taken care of, with his own children, her grandchildren, to help him around the ranch. And her worst fear was that she would die an old woman before he married, and then what would become of him? Who would care for him, her only son, her joy? So, she had to do something that he would eventually have to forgive her for. At least, she hoped he would. She placed an advert in the Matrimonial Times for a mail order bride. She knew it was a deceptive move on her part, and that he would be angry if he knew of it. But her heart was in the right place, and she knew God would forgive her. She was a smart woman. She had a plan, and she would see to it that her son had someone to take care of him and to share his life in the future. She knew how men were. If he were left alone, he would spend the next 10 years talking to no one but horses and realize far too late that he needed another soul in the house. The woman she had chosen from the responses to the advert was called Madison Edwards, and by her letters, she seemed like a good woman. Beautiful, or so Eleanor thought when she received the photograph, quick to learn, able to do any chores, capable, and eager to start a new life in the West. Eleanor had liked her right away, though it was sad that the woman thought she was speaking to Caleb instead of his mother. But they would get past that, Eleanor knew. Madison, too, would likely be angry with Eleanor. But Eleanor knew what she was doing. Her son and his new bride would be thanking her in a few weeks. Madison was set to arrive shortly, and after that, Eleanor would put her plan into motion. The plan mostly involved finding ways for these two to spend time together. She knew how young people were. A man and a woman out doing hard work together could only talk for so long before the heart started to long for more. For now, Eleanor spread butter on the freshly baked slices of bread and arranged them on a porcelain plate. She picked it up along with the tea and placed them in front of Caleb at the table, holding a cup of tea for herself. He smiled up at her, his face the mirror picture of her late husband's. Eleanor loved Lucas, her new husband, but her heart still ached at the thought of Caleb's father. He had been taken from her by a terrible illness during the winter 2 years ago, and Caleb had quickly left the house afterward. It had been a difficult time for her. But now Caleb was home. "You can make anything look beautiful, Ma," he told her. Eleanor cupped his face in one hand, full of love. "Thank you, Caleb, though I would tell you that any fresh loaf of bread is beautiful all by itself. Now eat up, because there's a lot of work ahead of you today." Chapter 3. Madison arrived at the train station utterly exhausted, but eager. The train ride had been long, at least for a young woman who had never gone on a train or indeed, any sort of long trip before. She was weary and anxious after spending so many hours basically alone, all the while worrying about what the future held for her. She had heard of women around town who had gone off to be mail order brides, had heard of women making new lives and new paths for themselves in the Wild West, but she had never really considered that she would have the courage to do it herself, yet here she was. She had left everything behind for a hard Western life, and her body thrummed with both nerves and excitement. Soon, she would meet her future husband. She knew Mr. Caleb Shaw was a good man. They had written long enough for her to be certain of that, and Providence wouldn't have sent her to a bad man besides. Soon she would be a wife. She was certain everything was going to go just fine. Still, for some reason, a strange dread lingered in her heart. It was as if a part of her couldn't help but be wary of the situation. What if she had been mistaken? What if Caleb had lied? Anyone could lie in writing. What if she had left her entire life behind for nothing? Not that her life had been the best. It's just anxiety over the long trip, she told herself firmly as she exited the train. Or maybe my heart is confused because I was afraid Maud would send me off to the highest bidder if I hadn't come for Caleb Shaw. There's nothing to fear here. Thinking of Maud back at the orphanage made her feel more certain about being here. Maud had sent several girls away to strange men who would pay a lot for a beautiful wife, and Madison had been terrified that the next one would be her. She had picked up the matrimonial times and written her own destiny. She had chosen her own man, and not for money. Madison shook her head of these thoughts and looked around the station with wide eyes. She'd been told Caleb would be waiting for her with a sign with her name written on it, and she felt relief when she spotted it in the distance. Madison Edwards, she read in big, stocky letters, and quickly made her way there, cutting a path through the throng of people. Thankfully, her satchel wasn't heavy. There wasn't much opportunity for a young woman to accumulate things in an orphanage, and she had brought only a few changes of clothes. Perhaps her husband would gift her more after they were married. But when she stopped in front of the sign, Madison realized it was being held by an elderly woman instead of a man. The dread turned to a ball of lead in her stomach. Where was the rancher Caleb, the person she had traded letters with? Maybe he had sent this woman to meet her, which saddened her. Hadn't her future husband wanted to see his new wife as soon as she arrived in his town? Miss Edwards, the elderly woman asked, looking Madison up and down. Madison resisted the urge to hug herself defensively, even though she knew she was dressed appropriately and even beautifully. "Thank you very much." But at least the woman seemed to have found her to her satisfaction. "Yes, ma'am," Madison said. "Are you here on behalf of Mr. Caleb Shaw? He was supposed to meet me here. He said he'd have a sign." "It's good to meet you," the woman said, lowering her sign. She got close to Madison, her expression serious, and put a hand on Madison's elbow. "Now listen, child. My name is Eleanor Jacobs, and Caleb Shaw is my son, and I was the one you traded letters with. I worry for him, but he would never search for a wife alone. He doesn't know I did this. Now, you need to pretend to be my nurse, do you hear? You'll stay by my side, then slowly you can start spending more time with him, and hopefully as the time passes, Caleb will marry you." "What?" Madison asked, gaping at her. Fear clawed at her throat and made the word come out scratchy and low. She tried to take a step back, but Eleanor had a tight grip on her arm and wouldn't let her go. "You lied to me? I came here for nothing?" "Oh, dear Lord," Madison thought, frightened. My dread was entirely justified, then. The heart always does know. She couldn't go back to the orphanage, not now after she had just left like she had, without a single word to anyone and with no expectations that people would take her back. She couldn't return. What was she going to do? She didn't want to go through with this anymore. She had set out here with hope, but look where it had gotten her. Curse this deceitful woman. "You came here to marry my son," Eleanor told her, voice firm. Her fingers were just as firm on Madison's elbow. "I'll make sure you do. I'm no fool. I have a plan, and it will work. God wouldn't have sent you into my path if this weren't supposed to all work out in the end, girl." Madison had indeed come here to marry this man, but now she had learned that the Caleb Shaw she had spoken to didn't even exist. Who knew who this man actually was? If his mother had to lie to a woman to find him a wife, maybe he was awful. From over Eleanor's shoulder, Madison could see the street outside and part of the darkening sky. The day had passed them by, and nightfall was quickly approaching. Madison felt her shoulders curl downwards under her fear. She was penniless and had nowhere to go. Perhaps the town had a boarding house? Maybe a helpful woman would find her on the street and take her in? The truth was, she had no real option but to leave with Eleanor. "All right," she said, though not without hesitation. Her voice shook slightly. "I'll go with you, but just for now, do you hear? I'm only going because I have nowhere else to spend the night." Eleanor smiled at her, triumphant, and turned around so they could head back toward her house. She had an empty wagon outside, like she had come alone. Of course, she had. Caleb Shaw didn't actually know Madison was here. Madison had no idea how to act like a nurse. Dear Lord, what situation had she put herself into? Madison clutched at her shawl and told herself that nothing could be worse than the orphanage back in Boston. Even if it hadn't quite worked out perfectly, she was still here out of her own choice. That had to mean something, even if her choice ended up being trouble. Caleb was speaking somewhat amicably, though distantly, with her mother's husband. Lucas Jacobs was a bland sort, and Caleb didn't really have any problems with him as a man. It was just that Mr. Jacobs was not his father and was thus a stranger in his house. Still, there wasn't much they could go awry when speaking about the ranch. It was a neutral enough topic of conversation. They were just commenting on how well the sheep were doing when his mother arrived back home. Caleb turned to the door with a relieved smile, and so did Mr. Jacobs. Night had fallen some time ago, and both of them had worried about Caleb's mother out there alone. Caleb had tried to pressure her earlier, telling her that he would come with her, but she had stood fast and refused. Why she was so adamant, he wasn't sure. But there wasn't much he could do against his mother when she made up her mind, no matter how much he disagreed with her decisions sometimes. Out of all the reasons to leave home close to nightfall, Caleb couldn't imagine his mother had left to pick up a guest she had told no one about. But there she was, standing at the door with a woman who was mostly hiding behind her. He was curious and his eyes widened. He hadn't interacted with a woman besides his own mother in quite some time, due to the nomadic lifestyle of his bounty hunter life, which was not the sort of life where one could find many good women around. He stood awkwardly and was wary of saying something wrong, which was one reason why he never wanted to go with his mother when she wanted to cart him around to meet neighboring women. "Good evening, Caleb and Lucas, my love," Eleanor said, ushering her guest in. Her husband quickly took the satchel from her, though it was small enough it probably hadn't been bothering her with its weight. "You know I am not the youngest woman in the world, and I find myself needing some help. Young Madison Edwards here will be my nurse from now on, do you hear? But she'll help us all out around the ranch." "Help us?" Lucas questioned. It was clear to see that he hadn't known a thing about this stranger, either, but he was quick to accommodate Eleanor. "I see," he said. "I remember you saying something about this now and then, about needing help, but I thought you were speaking about getting Caleb a wife. I didn't expect you to just bring a nurse home without saying anything. Is she from out of town? I don't recognize her." "Darlin', where did you find this girl?" "Hush, Lucas, I know what I'm doing," his mother replied. "And besides, please don't speak about Madison as if she's not here." "Well," Lucas mused, "I suppose there's not much we can do right now. I know anyone my dear Eleanor chooses is bound to be a good woman. Come in, Madison. Dinner time will be soon, and we have plenty of extra rooms in this big house for you to settle into." "Hello," Caleb said, a bit tongue-tied. He hoped Madison wouldn't notice his less-than-stellar manners. He wasn't rude, just unused to speaking to a woman, but he knew he could come off as aloof and arrogant if he wasn't careful. Caleb admitted to himself that this Madison woman was one of the most beautiful creatures he had ever seen, certainly more beautiful than any girl he had seen around Ellsworth since his return. Her hair was a fair blonde that fell to her shoulders in perfect ringlets and her skin was untanned. Her hands looked so soft and smooth. They spoke of a woman who definitely hadn't come from a farm. Lucas was right, who knew from where his mother had brought this woman? Maybe very far away. But what most caught his attention were the woman's eyes. They were a bright, shiny blue, the color of shining topaz, and filled with such beauty he found himself staring at her. She had a blush on her cheek and couldn't quite meet Caleb's eyes. Perhaps she was a bit shy, and Caleb found himself a bit charmed by that. "Hello, Mr. Shaw, she said, her voice quiet. You can call me Caleb, he told her, bowing his head slightly. He turned to his mother, grateful that the opportunity to make a fool of himself was over. Come, Ma, and take off your shoes. This is no time to be out and about. I really should have gone with you. Why the secrecy? Do you enjoy making us sweat and worry over you? His mother looked from Eleanor to Caleb and seemed satisfied with whatever it was she saw. God knew what that woman was thinking at any given time. Caleb had given up trying to figure out her mind. She finally turned to him and nodded. I have my reasons, boy. I'll be quick to show her to her room, then we can all settle down to eat. Dinner that evening was awkward at best. Madison said very little. As usual, his ma's cooking was delicious, and everyone seemed to eat with gusto. But the atmosphere was stilted. Strangely, it was Lucas who kept the conversation going. Madison was polite and seemed grateful for his chatter. Caleb was surprised. He'd never heard Lucas string so many words together at one sitting. His mother just kept smiling, looking at Madison and then at him and then at Lucas. During most of the meal, Caleb felt embarrassed, knowing he should be contributing more to the conversation. But as usual, he only felt tongue-tied.
Chapter 4. Eleanor made breakfast with the precision of a woman who had a gift for cooking, and indeed she had, because it was the tastiest breakfast Madison had had in years, and they all ate together. It was an uncomfortable meal, what with Mr. Jacobs chattering like he had known Madison for years, and Caleb acting like Madison was a stranger he wasn't sure about. It was unnerving, to say the least, but for some reason, Eleanor seemed satisfied. And so after breakfast was done, Madison went to wash the dishes. Madison had appearances to keep up with if she wanted to keep a roof over her head, Caleb's stilted behavior notwithstanding. But more than that, it was the least she could do. She didn't want to overthink the situation. She was at this ranch, and an old woman indeed needed her help. Madison couldn't just leave her to do everything alone. The daily chores in the home were pretty much what she had learned growing up at the orphanage. But tending animals was completely strange to her, so she focused on what she could do around the house instead of worrying about the animals. She remembered how cruel Maud had been when it came to getting chores done. The memories were recent and painful, and she was glad that Eleanor was sweet to her. Despite the fact that she had spent months lying to her, Madison found herself growing fond of Eleanor very quickly. They spoke while Madison made bread, they washed clothes and hung them on the clothesline together, they swept the house with Eleanor's old brooms. They laughed about the rooms that were perpetually filled with dust that the wind blew in. But Madison hadn't given up on changing the situation yet. This was temporary until she could find another solution, something else that would help her stay away from the orphanage and Maud, a place that wasn't filled with so many lies. She wasn't comfortable deceiving Caleb. Maybe she could find a job around town, though she couldn't think of any place that would want an out-of-towner with no idea what she could do. It troubled her, and she wasn't sure what to do about it. As she worked and lived on the ranch, she watched. And what she saw she found interesting. Eleanor didn't actually have the best relationship with her beloved only son. Of course, it was obvious that they loved each other, but they never truly listened to each other. The first example would of course be Eleanor lying to everyone about the reason Madison was there. Did she really think her son would never find out the ruse? Here, Eleanor said warmly, setting fresh toast and coffee on the table. After the meal, I'm thinking about going to town to meet the Robinsons. What do you think, Caleb? Caleb paused before speaking. It's a wonderful idea, he agreed. I think you'll feel good after an afternoon with your friends, Ma, and I'm glad Madison is here to help you, so you won't have so much work to do when you come home later. Yes, Eleanor replied, and Madison noticed the strange tone of her voice, as if she were happy her son seemed so caring, but a bit annoyed he hadn't understood the point of her comment. Why don't you come with me? It's been a long time since you've visited them, or anyone. And you seemed so worried about me going out alone the other day. And Madison can come along, too. I was worried the other day because it was late and getting dark, Caleb commented, and looked down at his plate. Ma, this coffee is the best coffee I've ever had. You make so much tea. A man needs his coffee, you know? Lucas agreed with a hearty nod. Eleanor, the boy has good sense in his head. We need more coffee in this house. Eleanor huffed out playfully, putting her hands on her waist. Well, then you go and buy coffee, Mr. Jacobs. And a woman needs her tea, too. Don't you think so, Madison? Ah. We did drink more tea than coffee at the orphanage, and we were all women there, Madison agreed, a bit self-consciously, but she was happy when Mr. Jacobs smiled kindly at her. When all else was uncomfortable, she could count on Mr. Jacobs to engage in conversation. Well, girl, that must have been something, being raised in an orphanage. Well, we're just glad that's all over with now. We'll get you drinking coffee, won't we? He gave her a playful smile and then nodded at Caleb and Eleanor. I shall take it upon myself to teach you all about coffee while you're here. Now, why don't you have some? Shall we say grace? Caleb asked, his voice interrupting the conversation. There's a lot of work to be done today, and we haven't even started eating yet. Caleb still never quite looked at Madison. To think she was supposed to be getting closer to him somehow. He hadn't reacted much when she'd mentioned that she was raised in an orphanage, but then, perhaps he didn't know what to say. She had no idea what Eleanor's great plan was, because for now, it mostly seemed like she wasn't doing much of anything in that area. Of course, Eleanor said and finally sat down. Madison noticed how distant Caleb seemed. He hadn't joined in on the joke, and he had rebuffed his mother's attempt at an outing. Madison found this sad, since she herself had only been here for a few days and already longed to go to the town again. Part of this was because she wanted to search for a job or any other way she might leave this ranch, but mainly it was because she wanted to explore. She wanted to meet people and visit the shops. With just Eleanor as a constant companion, she was growing a bit lonely. She had grown up in a house filled with other women, all of them always together and chatting with each other. Madison remembered Caleb telling her that he had been a bounty hunter for 2 years before returning home. No, it was Eleanor who I was talking to, she reminded herself firmly. The thought of all the anticipation she had experienced in her correspondence made her sad. It meant nothing now. She didn't know Caleb at all. She shook her head, not wanting to think of it anymore. She should have known better than to believe everything people wrote to her. Still, if Eleanor's words had been true, that meant Caleb had been away from home for 2 years before returning. That could account for any awkwardness he had, even with his own mother. Madison drank her coffee and told herself it was none of her business. She would be out of here soon, for sure. But she couldn't help but think that even though the circumstances here on the ranch weren't the most favorable, she would still rather be here than back in Boston, at the orphanage with Maud, watching as the girls were slowly and secretly sold off. A day later, the 2 women were out feeding the chickens while Mr. Jacobs and Caleb were taking care of the other animals. So, Madison, how have you been leaking it around here these days? Asked Eleanor. It's been good, Madison admitted. She was doing chores like she had in Boston, but everything was nicer here on the ranch. And she was fond of Eleanor. I like the ranch, and I bet I'll like the town too when I go there. I'm plumb pleased to hear you say that, Eleanor said, satisfied. You've been a big help to me since you arrived a week or so ago, but we can't forget why you're here. I can't help but notice that you and my boy haven't really been speaking at all. I'm an old woman, but I can handle myself. From now you go on to help Caleb with his daily tasks. Madison stiffened. I don't know how to run a ranch or anything like that, she was quick to say. And Caleb surely won't like it. He'll see me as interfering. You will learn all you need to know, Eleanor said with a shake of her head. You're young and you're strong. There's a lot to do here, and you'll get used to it quickly. You leave the bread making and the dishes to me, Madison. Look, Caleb is probably with the horses right now. And he won't see you as interfering. Oh. Not right now, Madison said, mortified, taking a step back. Eleanor, I can't just, it's the middle of the day and I'm helping you. Surely, you can give me one last day before you send me off after him? There's no need to be so dramatic, child, Eleanor said, but she seemed amused. All right, I won't refuse another hand helping me wash the sheets today. God knows my back hurts enough on its own. But tomorrow. Madison swallowed and groaned. Tomorrow, I'll start helping Caleb more. All right. Chapter 5. It was obvious Madison had never worked on a ranch, much less on a ranch in the West, with its brutal non-stop work. Caleb didn't understand why his mother had her nurse out there helping him with his tasks, but with how he had refused his mother so many things these past few months, he hadn't had the heart to refuse this. Although, he was plenty irritated about it. Didn't his mother realize Madison was a woman? Why in the world did she expect Madison to do a man's work? He taught the young woman the best he could for a couple of days, and she learned quickly, which was a relief. She didn't complain about sore muscles, and she didn't hesitate to ask if she had a question. Caleb respected that in a woman. Early one morning, they were making their way to the stables after breakfast. Caleb was going to show Madison how to take care of the horses. They were due for a brushing if nothing else, and Caleb always found excuses to visit them. He looked to his side, at the woman walking next to him, and noticed at once her smile and her bright eyes, and the slight bounce to her step. We're taking care of the horses this morning, Caleb commented quietly, just to see how she would answer. I saw we were heading to them, Madison answered, and though she averted her eyes calm Caleb, her smile widened, and her cheeks grew pink. You seem happy about that. Do you know how to ride? Caleb asked without thinking. Now, why had he opened that particular subject when he might end up having to follow through with some riding lessons? Madison's expression grew wistful, but also soft, and she still appeared too shy to look at him. Caleb couldn't help thinking yet again about how beautiful she was. Her hair shone in the sunlight. He looked away from her, hoping she wouldn't catch his expression. I have always dreamed of learning how to ride a horse, she finally confessed. I didn't have much opportunity, and then I always thought, who would want to teach me? But I've always dreamed. It must be the best feeling in the world, being on a horse's back. They walked in silence for a moment. Despite the fact that he'd spoken without thinking, he took a minute to think about what he was going to say now. In the end, it wasn't that much of a difficult decision to make. Caleb was a simple man. He wanted to make a beautiful woman happy. I can teach you, he offered. Madison finally turned to look at him, and her expression was the brightest thing he had ever seen, immediately making him glad for his offer. She seemed to forget her earlier nervousness and leaned closer to him, her eyes shining with hope. The edge of her skirts brushed against his legs. Really? She asked. Would you do that? I know there's a lot of work to be done here at the ranch, and I don't mean to impose. But if you're willing to do it, Caleb, it'd make me the happiest woman in this town. Caleb laughed. Something so simple like riding a horse can make you so happy? She just smiled at him. Caleb found her intriguing and beautiful, and her apparent love of horses made him feel softer toward her since he loved horses, too. He always had for as long as he could remember, ever since he had been very small and his dad had taken him to meet the horses on the ranch. The care of the horses had fallen to Caleb after his father died, but Caleb had left. Now, he was just trying to do his duty and make up for leaving them. They arrived at the stables. Caleb had brought some treats for the horses, and he gave a beaming Madison half of them, happy to have someone to share this with. Madison learned to ride as quickly as she had learned all the chores to do around the ranch. She was so excited that it made Caleb happy just to witness her joy. She had a way with the horses he couldn't explain. All of them appeared to love her, letting her pet them and braid their hair, accepting anything she gave them. They seemed to like her more than him, and he had grown up with them. One mare, Madison's favorite, was fond of trying to eat her hair as if it were hay, and the two of them laughed together many times over it. As soon as she had learned, he and Madison went horseback riding together. The horses were a good buffer between them, and Madison seemed to appreciate them as something that they could always discuss. Soon her nervousness left her, and the conversation between them flowed easily. It felt to Caleb as if they had known each other for a long time, and he couldn't comprehend the fact that they had barely spoken for days when she had first arrived. She was a gentle woman, and even working around the ranch, her hands had remained soft-looking. She got sunburned a lot, though, and many evenings, Caleb had given her salve to spread on the bridge of her nose. A month and more passed by and Madison forgot that she was supposed to be thinking about leaving the ranch and this family behind. After she and Caleb went out with the horses for the first time, and then a second and a third time, all her fears regarding the rancher left her. He was as much the good man she had thought he was when she believed she was reading his letters. Their friendship had only grown as they worked together, and Madison couldn't help but think that there could be more between them. Sometimes Caleb looked at her in a way that gave her hope. Maybe she could still have the life she had come here to live. She tugged at her hair as she fed the horses, peering at Caleb from behind one. He was a little ways from her, brushing down a mare. His gentleness made her feel safe. And he was undoubtedly a handsome man. He had wheat blonde hair and blue eyes like her, though they weren't as light. Madison blushed at her own thoughts and looked away. "Don't forget you're living here on a lie," she reminded herself, growing sad. She wasn't Eleanor's nurse, and she hadn't been brought here to help with the chores, though those had become her duty. The more time she and Caleb spent together, the harder it was for her to keep the lie to herself. She didn't want to do this to him. What was she supposed to do, marry him on a lie and never reveal the secret? Still, she couldn't find it in herself to tell him. More than a month had passed, and the thought of Caleb growing angry and sending her back to the orphanage sent chills down her spine. Before, she hadn't told because she feared having to go back to the orphanage, but now. "Madison, are you done?" Caleb called out, interrupting her thoughts. "Almost," she told him, getting a grip on herself. "This lad is hungry. Maybe we could get some more hay for him? And spoil him?" Caleb asked with a smile. "I can see what kind of mother you'll be. You'll spoil your children rotten." "I will do no such thing," Madison exclaimed, her face growing hot. She put her hands on her hips, feeling a bit playful. "Now what kind of father will you be, Caleb? Would you leave your child to starve?" "That horse just had lunch," Caleb defended himself, lifting his hands. The two of them broke into laughter, unable to continue the silliness. Madison grew warm and happy with the thought that she was supposed to be his bride, but the happiness quickly left her when she remembered her circumstances. She wasn't actually his bride. Caleb could very well not want her, and then what would become of her? "Madison?" Caleb asked softly, walking up to her. He put a hand on her shoulder. "Is everything all right? Your face just fell just now." I'd never seen a smile leave someone's face so fast. "It's nothing," she told him, shaking her head. She looked away. I get homesick sometimes, you know how it is." He nodded, though a line stayed between his brows, and the lie felt like it burned up her throat as she uttered it. She didn't feel homesick, she would do anything to never return to Boston. But it was best to keep her dark secret hidden from him. Chapter 6. Eleanor peered into the stables on her way to their crops and saw Caleb comforting Madison. They were standing together, and he had a hand on her shoulder, and she was leaning slightly toward him. Earlier that day, she had peeked through a small hole into the chicken's coop and saw Caleb and Madison laughing together. His eyes were bright, and her smile was wide. They were standing so close, one of the chickens couldn't have walked between them if it had tried. At dusk, Eleanor looked through the kitchen window and saw Caleb and Madison walking close together on their way back to the house after a day's work, their shoulders brushing as they went. They stole glances at each other when the other wasn't looking. Eleanor prepared dinner with a smug smile on her face that had lingered there for days now. Her plan was working brilliantly so far. She knew she had picked the perfect woman for her son. Caleb opened the door for Madison, and Eleanor heard the end of a soft laugh from him. She was satisfied with the fact that her son was content again. She could only hope that Madison would stick to their agreement. The last thing they needed was that silly girl spilling something to him in a moment of weakness. "You two are late comin' back home," Eleanor commented innocently as they took off their boots. She stood at the stove, stirring the stew. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Eleanor, Madison was quick to say, apologetic, and hurried to her side. I didn't mean to leave you to make dinner alone. Tell me, how can I help? I can make stew on my own, girl, Eleanor said dryly, though fondly. She liked Madison and how helpful she was. Eleanor had no doubt that when they married, Madison would be a great wife. Still, having her help was a good excuse to keep the girl near. But you can go ahead and start setting the table for me, if you want. Caleb, run along and get washed up a bit. All right, he said, not without a lingering look at Madison. Eleanor smiled and pretended she didn't see, because the way men worked, he would clam up if he saw her looking. Madison, how was your day today? Eleanor asked. It was a good day, Madison answered with a smile, already pulling dishes from the cupboard. Tiring, but it's good to be tired after a day's work. Eleanor nodded, pleased by the answer. I'm glad. Now I heard last time I was in town that there's a dance about to happen in the town's hall in 3 or 4 days. A dance? Madison asked, turning to Eleanor with a bright expression, though it dimmed after a moment. Oh, I'd like to go, but I have no clothes suitable for a dance, and no one to go with. None of that, Madison, I have clothes to lend to you, Eleanor chided softly. And of course, you have someone to go with. Please, girl. I've arranged for you and Caleb to attend. I'll tell him during dinner. I just wanted to tell you that this is a great opportunity, so you should make good use of it. Madison stiffened. Aye. All right, she said, her voice small. Eleanor felt her heart melt. Madison was a good woman, and this whole situation must be hard on her. Eleanor had her reasons, but she wasn't an unkind woman. You just go and dance then, she said gently. And I'm not reminding you to do anything you don't already want to do, am I? Madison's fair cheeks turned red as tomatoes. In the beginning, Eleanor had to talk fast to get Caleb to agree. He played at being annoyed and inconvenienced at the very idea of the dance. But in truth, Eleanor had a suspicion he was pleased. After all, what man wouldn't want to escort a beautiful woman to a dance? Once he did agree, Eleanor moved on to other important issues. She lent Madison a striking dress. It was dark blue and not too fancy, because what farm wife would have a fancy dress? But it was perfect for Madison, who had never really cared about this kind of thing. It seemed to have been made with the purpose of bringing out Madison's eyes. Madison found herself pleased when an equally dressed-up Caleb took one look at her, and a blush of pleasure rose to his face. Caleb led her to their wagon with her hand on his arm, then drove them to the town and to the town's hall. The dance had just started, they were right on time. Maybe next time, they could arrive early and help people arrange things. It was pleasant to help out with community events once in a while. When Madison went to step down from the wagon, Caleb caught her hand to help her, and she blushed. They walked close together. People took note of them as they went. Surely, they all knew Caleb since he grew up there, but they would know her only vaguely, from her rare, short trips into town with Eleanor. Madison would usually become shy at such attention, but with Caleb at her side, she found herself smiling at the people instead. They would all think she was his, she knew, and for this one evening, she wanted to believe it, too. They entered the town's hall, and it was unlike anything Madison had ever seen. She had never really been to a proper dance, not with Maud breathing down her neck to do every chore known to God and man. She felt like she was glowing as Caleb led her around. He greeted people with her always at his side, introducing her as Miss Madison Edwards and nothing more, and she was sure that people thought the two of them were courting. Some commented on it, and Caleb always laughed it off, but he didn't deny it. Madison bit her bottom lip and didn't know what to think about that, but it wasn't like she was denying it either. You seem anxious, Caleb said in a low voice after they had run out of people to greet. It's just a lot of new people, Madison said with a shake of her head. But I'll be just fine. Though I would like something to drink. Is there water around? Caleb smiled at her and quickly fetched her a drink of punch, which she drank gladly. Then they stood next to each other, her hand still on his elbow, and looked out at where the people were dancing. The music was lively, and everyone was smiling. Madison found herself yearning to be out there too, with her dress flying around her and Caleb close. Caleb cleared his throat and turned to her. "Madison," he asked, "how about a dance?" Madison's eyes shone with joy as she accepted. They danced so close together Madison wondered if Caleb knew the effect he was having on her. His hand on her hand was rough but gentle. He was so close to her that she could see every detail of his smile. She felt downright giddy, and she couldn't stop smiling. Caleb laughed at everything she said, be it funny or not, and she was delighted that he found anything she said entertaining. The evening was filled with more fun and laughter than she had had in any other day of her life. Madison grinned so much her cheeks hurt, and Caleb's own face was attractively flushed, and Madison couldn't help but think of him and of their future and what it could be. She wanted to kiss him. She could be his, and he looked like he wanted her. Madison was sure of it the entire night as they danced, with neither of them dancing even once with another person. When they arrived back at the ranch, Madison didn't know how her exhausted feet were still able to carry her. Again, Caleb helped her down from the wagon, and she had her hand on his elbow as they walked to the house. She had the feeling that if it weren't less than proper, he would have carried her in his arms. "I have to check on something out here for a moment," he told her apologetically, giving her a small smile. "You go on in and get some rest." "All right," Madison said, and wished him good night. He leaned forward and kissed her, not on the lips, but just on the edge of them, his lips brushing her skin so lightly it was more a breath than a touch. "Good night," he murmured. Madison blushed, lifting a hand to her cheek, and felt that coming here had been the best decision of her life. Caleb sat down on the veranda and tried to focus on the amazing day he had just had. He thought of Madison's smile, the flush on her face, her bright halo of hair under the lights of the town's hall. He almost desperately thought of her beautiful eyes. It had been the best night of his life, and for the hours they had danced, he had felt like he had found the woman who would be his future wife. But he sat and scanned the horizon with his eyes, unable to shake the uneasy feeling that had come to him as soon as they had arrived back at the ranch. The truth was that he'd had the feeling that something was wrong for days now. He couldn't shake it off, much as he had tried. He had been able to forget it while they were at the dance, but now he didn't know how wise it was to try and shake off this feeling anymore. It reminded him of the days when he and Anton were bounty hunters, and this kind of gut feeling meant trouble was just around the corner. He wasn't a bounty hunter anymore, but he knew he should trust his instincts. He strained his ears, waiting for something he couldn't guess at. He bolted upright when a howl sounded in the distance. There was a rustling in the bushes. Caleb stood still as a statue, staring ahead, straining his eyes against the dark of the night, but it was useless. He couldn't see anything. The minutes passed, and nothing else happened. Eventually, he had to get inside, though his hands took a long time to uncurl from fists. When he slept that night, he dreamed of Rufus Cobalt with his guns hot and smoking, and slick, scarlet blood on his hands. Caleb woke up late, not by much, but just enough that he was the last one to sit down at the breakfast table. He mumbled a good morning to everyone and served himself, quickly gulping down his mother's scalding tea. He couldn't stop thinking about his nightmare, with Rufus Cobalt appearing before his eyes any time he blinked. "Are you all right?" Madison asked him in a low tone of voice, low enough that only he could hear her. Caleb shook his head and didn't look at her. He didn't want to plague her with his dark thoughts, even though he had told her during one of the many times they had lingered together and talked about his life as a bounty hunter and the day he lost Anton. He didn't remember whose blood was in Rufus's hand in his dream. It had probably been Anton's. But sitting here beside Madison in his sunny kitchen, Caleb was struck by the thought that it could have been Madison's. Anton had had years of being a bounty hunter under his belt, and he had died. What if Rufus came back? Rufus hadn't been the only one Caleb had angered. What if any of them came after him? The life of a bounty hunter was hard, and it all followed you home if you tried to come back. Anton had told him that when he had taken him in. Anyone who grew close to Caleb was in danger, and Madison would have absolutely no way to defend herself. "Are you sure you're all right?" Madison asked him again, clearly worried. "I'm fine," Caleb said curtly, standing up from the table. "I'm done here, so I'll go take care of the horses. Madison, you don't need to come with me today. Just help my mother round the house like you used to." She looked up at him with surprise, but he looked away quickly and was out the door. He wouldn't put her in danger. He couldn't do it, not after he had lost Anton. He would protect Madison as much as he could. He would give people no reason to think about going after her. He groaned. His thoughts were becoming jumbled, not making much sense now. He should never have let things go as far between himself and Madison as they had. She was only there to take care of his mother. She wasn't there to be his bride. Caleb would intentionally stop thinking about her and go back to how his life had been before, no matter what his heart wanted. Chapter 7. Madison took a moment to look out at the blue sky before she left her room and started the day. She had woken up late. Chores around the ranch normally started before the sun was up, not late enough for it to be blazing down like this, but this wasn't the orphanage and Maud wasn't here. No one had come to drag her out and punish her for oversleeping. They had been kind and had let her sleep a little longer. So Madison sat on her bed and looked out at the beautiful day. She could see part of the ranch from here, the chicken's coop, part of the crops. Caleb was surely out there, but Madison couldn't see him. It felt like she hadn't seen him in days. She stood and leaned out the window. She looked to one side, then the other, squinting at the distance, but it was no use. He wasn't anywhere, and it was likely that if he were somewhere, she would see him from here. But he wouldn't turn his face and smile at her, much less give her a good morning. Lately, he had barely looked at her. Madison sighed and sat back down on the bed. It was that kiss, Madison thought to herself, picking at the edge of her sleeve. There's no other reason for him to have become like this so suddenly. So distant and quiet. He regrets kissing me like he did. It started right after that kiss. "Don't think you can do this every day," came a stern, though not angry voice from the doorway. Madison's gaze snapped up, and she saw Eleanor with her hands on her hips, a worried, upset frown on her face. "There's too much work around here for you to take your sweet time waking up like this, you know, girl." "I know," Madison said, her head hanging. "I promise it won't happen again, Eleanor." "You're fine, Madison." "I was worried is all." But to Madison it was evident that Eleanor was upset. Clearly, she had noticed how differently Caleb was acting toward her. Madison resisted the urge to sigh again. It wasn't like she could do anything about it. And he had been the one to kiss her. Madison shook her thoughts from the kiss. The last thing she wanted to do was give Eleanor any hint that something like that had happened. It wasn't like it mattered now, anyway. "Now tell me," Eleanor said, closing the door behind herself and stepping into Madison's room. She didn't sit down, she loomed. Madison couldn't quite look at her. "Did you say anything to Caleb? Did you tell him about our deal? He's been strange ever since you two went to that dance. Did you let it slip while people were asking around about why you were here?" "No," Madison exclaimed, horrified. Oh, how much more Caleb would hate her if he knew. She could never tell him, especially after a kiss had done this. She wouldn't add any reasons that would make him hate her. "I would never." "Oh, Eleanor, I didn't say anything, but it was such a good evening. He was so sweet those hours we danced together, and it felt like everything was all right. I thought it didn't matter why I was here, because I was where I was meant to be. But the next morning, he turned away from me. I don't know what to do. God knows I don't know what to do, Eleanor." "Oh, Madison. The two of you will make me sick with all this worrying," Eleanor said, finally loosening her stance. She sat down beside Madison and put a hand on her shoulder. "There must be some reason he's become like this. My boy is not a crazy man, he must have his reasons. If we find out what happened, we can fix it." Madison didn't want to tell Eleanor they had kissed and that the kiss had been the reason for everything. So, she let Eleanor speculate, not saying a single thing. Caleb had lost the habit of going to town frequently, but these days had been so full of stress that he finally got on his horse and went. He couldn't bear being in the front room with Madison close by, being unwilling to talk to her, all the while seeing her upset face. Truth be told, he had missed going to saloons. They reminded him of Anton and all the times they had sat on the stools together, gladly recounting their adventures. Ellsworth's saloon was a small building, but it looked wider from the inside. Caleb sat alone and drank a little, feeling as if he hadn't a friend in the world. Madison had come to mean too much to him. He couldn't put her in danger. He couldn't stop his mind from mulling over his past. He and Anton had made plenty of enemies in his time as a bounty hunter. Enemies that would jump at the chance of hurting anyone he cared about. No matter what silly thoughts he'd had about marriage while they had been dancing, he had to put them aside right now. Just rumors, a gruff voice beside him was saying, but it's been worrying me for days now. At least, by what people have been saying, he's alone. I don't know what happened to his brothers, but if God is just, and I know he is, they'll be where they belong, under the ground. I can only hope they're joined by their brother soon. Caleb's eyebrows furrowed. He looked at the man sitting on a stool beside him. He was slouched and tired-looking, with a dirty mustache. He was nursing a beer, rocking his glass from side to side and making the liquid swish around without taking a sip. His words were curious and familiar, and Caleb wanted to know more. The man caught him looking. "Name's Frank," the man told him, tipping his head slightly. "Have ye heard the news?" "I haven't been around town these days," Caleb said with a shake of his head. "Name's Caleb. Who is it that's hanging around that you hate so much, you wish he and his whole family was dead?" "If you know who they are, you'll be wishing it too," Frank said with confidence, leaning toward Caleb. "The notorious outlaw Rufus Cobalt been seen hanging around these parts." Caleb tensed, not wanting to believe his ears. "So I was right," he told himself, downing his beer in one last gulp. "That man's around here, where my family is." "You look like you know him," Frank commented with a raised eyebrow as Caleb stood up and threw some coins at the counter. Caleb gave Frank a firm nod. "I know him. His brothers are under the ground where they belong. I was there when it happened." Frank looked surprised. "Were you the one who killed them?" "Me and Aunt, a friend," Caleb said, stumbling over Anton's name. He put a hand on Frank's shoulder. "Be safe out there. I know how Rufus Cobalt can be, and if he's around, he won't hesitate to kill anyone he sees in his way. I'll be going now." "All right," Frank said. "You be safe as well, friend." Caleb rushed out of the saloon and hopped onto his horse. He cursed himself as he raced home. What was he doing out here so late at night? He couldn't let his guard down like that. God bless the fact that he had not been stupid enough to drink too much. Rufus had been watching. He felt it. It was likely Rufus had been there watching that very night on the veranda when he'd heard something. To think that man could be so close to his home. Caleb had to get home and see for himself that his mother and Madison were safe. He had lost Anton. He couldn't lose anyone else. Madison could have cried with fear and relief when she heard the sound of a horse's gallop that meant Caleb had come back home. Mr. Jacobs was still visiting kin in another town and wouldn't return for a couple of days, and Madison had been left alone that evening to deal with watching over Eleanor. Eleanor had been feeling poorly of late, and her condition had only grown worse as the hours of the evening had passed, and Madison had no idea what to do. She was hot to the touch and ached all over. She'd started coughing, a rough deep cough that frightened Madison. She gave Eleanor plenty of cool water and even pressed a damp cloth to her head, but nothing had helped. Madison knelt beside her on the bed and clasped her hand between hers. "Eleanor, Eleanor," she chanted, "I don't know what to do." "It's only a fever and a small cough," Eleanor said, her voice weak. She gave Madison's hand a weak squeeze. "Remember not to tell Caleb. Don't tell him what I done." Madison shook her head and said nothing. How could she not tell him the truth? What else could she say when he asked why a nurse wasn't doing her work, was just sitting there like a stump while his mother got worse? Madison wasn't like Eleanor, she couldn't think of a plan. She had enough trouble lying already without panic suffocating her like it was doing right now. Ma? Madison? Caleb's distressed voice echoed through the house. Does he already know that his mother is sick? Madison asked herself, tense. Caleb, we're in your mother's room, Madison called, and Caleb appeared at the doorway quickly. He relaxed when he saw them but grew tense again when he noticed the high flush on his mother's face and the desperation on Madison's. Madison herself had only gotten sick a few times, all when she had been very young, and she couldn't remember much more than feeling miserable and tired. Sick people at the orphanage were separated from the rest of them, and only Maud would go in and out to see them, telling the others that she didn't want to spread the sickness around. As ironic as it was, considering the lie Eleanor had chosen to tell, Madison had absolutely no idea how to take care of a sick person. She still had a wet rag on Eleanor's forehead, but she had no idea what else a nurse should do. Perhaps she should have changed Eleanor's sweat-soaked clothes, but she couldn't invade the woman's privacy like that. She was a bit poorly all day, only a bit weakened, Madison said, her voice thick with unshed tears. I told her to rest, but she wouldn't listen. She kept saying there was much to do, and look where it got her. She grew more ill when the sun set, and the fever won't go down, and now she's coughing. Caleb entered the room and knelt by the bed beside Madison. He took his mother's hand from Madison's, shocked at how warm it was. You've done everything? Nothing will help? He asked her, his bright blue eyes wide with worry. It was the closest they had been since that night, their shoulders just a hair's breadth apart. It was the least guarded and distant he had been. Madison put her face in her hands, unable to look at him anymore. She was going to lose him. And maybe this dear woman. Oh, how the world was unfair. How she wished, suddenly, that Eleanor had never lied to her and brought her out west. Caleb, I'm no nurse, she cried, distraught. I'm so sorry. I have no idea what to do. I'm not a nurse. I've never taken care of someone sick. Your mother spoke to me through letters for months, but I thought I was speaking to you. She brought me here to be your mail order bride. She said you wouldn't accept it, and that we should lie, but I swear, I didn't want to. Caleb looked at her in shock. He blinked and his mouth fell open. His shock quickly turned to anger, and he stood up at once, his hands closed in fists at his sides. He glared down at her, and Madison felt very small. What had she been thinking? She should have gone back to the orphanage at once when she had heard Eleanor's tale at the station. He grabbed her forearm and dragged her up. It didn't hurt, but it made Madison cry even harder. How could you? He asked. How could you lie? You've been lying this whole time? Everything you said, everything we did, it was all a lie? Your mother insisted, and I had nowhere else to go. I couldn't say no. Move away. Go write a letter to fetch Mother's husband. Leave me alone with her. Unlike you, I know what to do, and she'll be better with me here. I can't even look at you right now. Go away from me, Madison. Madison fled the room, tears sliding down her red face. Caleb waited until Madison was nowhere to be seen before going to the kitchen to make a poultice for his mother's chest. He fetched more cool water. And then, with his jaw set, he went back to his mother to tend to her. After long hours, he managed to bring down Eleanor's fever. Her cough lessened and she rested more soundly. Only then did he leave her room to sleep, when the sun rose up in the sky again the next day. Chapter 8. Caleb slept fitfully and had strange, worried dreams. The first thing he did when he woke up was visit his mother again. Madison had obviously been doing the chores alone around the house, though it was clear she was staying out of his way. Caleb shook his head and shook her from his mind. He didn't want to think about Madison. Ever. His mother was sitting up in bed with a tray by her, clearly breakfast Madison had brought in. The food on the plate had been picked at, so thankfully his mother was eating something at least. Caleb managed to give her a tight smile. No matter how relieved he was at her renewed health, her betrayal still stung. He knew they weren't the best at speaking to each other, but he never thought she would deceive him like this. "Caleb," she said softly, setting her hand on top of his on the bed. Her skin was still a bit too warm, but hopefully the fever was truly gone. He knew his mother, and knew that before long, she would be up and working again. "How are you? You are in bed for so long, it's already so late." "Me? How am I?" "The question is, how are you?" "You are the one who was sick," Caleb told her, shaking his head. He looked away, out the window. Tears sprung to his mother's eyes, and she sniffed loudly. "You know. Madison told me. Forgive me, please, son. I knew you'd be like this when you found out. Yes, I brought Madison here to be your mail order bride. I thought there was no other way. I'm an old woman, Caleb, and I couldn't bear to think of you alone on this ranch after I'm gone." "It wasn't up to you," Caleb protested. "I don't understand how you could have done this. What will we all do now? You brought Madison out here? Both of you lied. I need some time. I need to think about this, to process this. I can't believe this was all a lie." "It wasn't all a lie," Eleanor interrupted firmly, squeezing his hand. "You know that, Caleb. You can't miss the way that woman looks at you." Caleb took his hand from hers and stood. "I don't want to listen to you right now," he snapped. He regretted speaking like that to his own ma, but his temper had surged. He had found out about Rufus, then about the lies, and stayed up all night. All men had their limits. He knew she meant well, but his nerves felt frayed, and he felt betrayed. "All right," his mother said hesitantly. "We'll speak later, but we will talk about this soon." He nodded, though he had no wish to talk about this with anyone ever. Caleb arrived while Madison was brushing her favorite horse's hair. Truth be told, there were many chores to be done, and brushing a horse's mane and braiding it definitely wasn't one of those, but Madison was so distraught after everything that had happened that she had to take a break. First, she had spent the entire day worrying and stressing about Eleanor, and then she had to bear the wound of Caleb's anger. She hadn't realized, stupid and thoughtless as she had been, that Caleb would show up at the stables. But of course, he would. He loved horses as much as she did. This was where he went when he had to think, when he was tired, when he had any free time at all. "Good morning," he said stiffly, without looking her in the eye. He moved to get hay to feed the animals. Madison didn't even have time to respond before he turned his back to her. She understood why he was acting like that, but it was an ache in her heart. She went back to her brushing, ashamed and feeling small. Here she was doing something silly while Caleb, who had stayed up all night after a full day at the ranch, was working. "I should leave," she thought. "There's nothing for me here now that Caleb doesn't want me. I'm no nurse, and there's no future for me staying in some random ranch in Texas. I don't have to return to the orphanage, but maybe I could make a life in the city somehow." But she had nowhere to go and no one else in her life. She had grown fond of Eleanor and her husband, and she liked being useful around the house. She had grown fond of Caleb, and more. She remembered his kiss and despaired. There was no future for her here. She should leave at once. She was at fault for the discord between Caleb and Eleanor. But then she thought of his kiss again, and tears sprang to her eyes. The truth was that Madison worried about her future, but she loved Caleb. Simply, she despaired over being the reason for his sadness and the tension between them. She hadn't wanted to lie. Maybe that had been why he had grown distant after he kissed her. Maybe he had already noticed then that something wasn't right with her. Maybe this was all poison from the start. Chapter 9. A few days later, Madison washed the dishes while Eleanor went out to take lunch to Caleb, who was out on the ranch somewhere, working. Eleanor insisted she was well enough to be out and about, and Madison had to agree. Eleanor had rallied well and was back to herself. Madison was glad, both for Eleanor and for herself. She was still too upset to go near Caleb again. She only hoped Lucas came back home soon, because the tension between Madison, Caleb, and Eleanor was too awful for Madison to handle for much longer. Caleb wasn't even eating with them anymore. He stayed outside during lunch and took dinner to eat on the porch alone. Madison had tried to think of a way to fix this and hadn't found one solution that satisfied and had thus settled into a quiet misery. Before all this happened, Caleb and she had spoken to each other during the long days they had worked together. He had told her of his old life, of the Cobalt brothers, and how they had taken Anton and delivered him to God in the worst possible way. As far as she knew, however, all that was over. Caleb had left that life and started fresh. She missed those days. Missed how much they had talked and shared with each other. Madison washed the dishes now, up to her elbows in water, and though she had many reasons to feel fear, not one of them was a fear of being home by herself. "Hello, there," came a slow, foul voice from behind her. Madison screamed and jumped back, but the man was faster, and quicker than she could react. He had a gun to her head. Her mind whirled. Who was this man? Why was he coming after her? What was he planning to do? Her gaze flew around the kitchen. Was there a weapon she could grab? "Oh, please, Eleanor, don't come back. Don't walk in on this." Maybe he had even been in the house before, and that thought terrified her. But none of that helped Madison right now. She pressed a hand on her chest, her heart in her throat. "Now, don't try anything funny," the man told her, his stale breath assaulting her senses. "You're comin' with me to a special place, and you're comin' quiet, you hear me?" Madison closed her eyes for a moment, turning her face slightly away from the fetid smell of his breath. Tears gathered in her eyes and escaped, sliding down her cheek. "Why, yes," she gasped out. "You get a paper and write something down for me," he ordered. The exact words, Miss Edwards. Miss Edwards? He knew her name? "Who are you?" she cried. He gave another guttural laugh. "Don't you know? Ain't you guessed? I'm Rufus Cobalt. Now, do as you're told." She did exactly as she was told, trembling as she wrote the words, and her letters came out shaky. He wanted a duel with her life on the line, and Madison had no time to try and write a message to Caleb before the man slapped the paper away from her hands. It fluttered to the floor of the kitchen. She wailed when he grabbed her arm and dragged her out the door. "Please, God," she prayed desperately, looking wildly around the ranch, but neither Eleanor nor Caleb were around to see her and what was happening to her. "Please let them see that I'm gone right away. Please let Caleb come to me in time." As Rufus Cobalt dragged her to his wagon, Madison remembered suddenly that even though she and Caleb had grown close, now the man could barely look at her, and her fear and desperation grew until they were choking her. "Please have Eleanor convince Caleb to come for me," she prayed, almost a shout to the skies. Even if Caleb had pushed her away, she and Eleanor were still friends. Eleanor, if no one else, would notice her absence. If he doesn't care about me anymore, if he won't come for me, let his mother's love convince him. Please, dear Lord. Caleb was keeping busy. He was cleaning out the barn, which was necessary work, if boring and tiring. It was good enough to take his mind off things, though, and that was all he wanted. Normally, he would be out with the horses, but now they made him think too much of Madison. It felt like it was only yesterday that they had ridden together for the first time. He shook his head with a sigh and sat down on a bale of hay for a moment. It seemed like no matter what he did, Madison was on his mind. This whole business with his mother being sick and with finding out about all the lying had made a mess of his thoughts. All he wanted to do was get some work done. He hadn't even seen the woman properly for days, but it still wasn't enough for him to get his thoughts straight about this whole business. "If you keep scowling like that, your face will get stuck," came a dry, amused voice from the door. Caleb smiled thinly at his mother. "I'm not scowling, Ma. I brought you some lunch, since you decided not to grace us with your presence today," she said, ignoring his words. She entered the barn and gave him his lunch, which was simple but filling. She sat down on a crate by his side, gathering her skirts about her, and Caleb sighed. Apparently, the conversation she had promised him was happening right now, whether he liked it or not. "Caleb, we need to talk." "Here it is," he thought. "Ma, I came out here because I needed time." "You've had a lot of time, Caleb." You need to gather your thoughts already, to reconsider all this, she told him, holding one hand of his between hers. Madison is a good woman, and she will be a good wife. I saw how you two looked at each other before this whole story came out. Caleb, please, just think about it. He shook his head, taking his hand back. He knew she was right, but... I won't make any promises, Ma, he told her. You can start by coming back to the house with me right now, she pleaded. At least come and tell that girl that you won't leave her penniless on the street. She's been so worried, you can't imagine. She didn't know, Caleb. She thought she was talking to you when I was writing her all those letters. Don't make the poor girl suffer for something I did. And you forgave me, didn't you? You can forgive her. I wouldn't leave her in the streets, Caleb said, offended his mother thought he would do something like that. What good Christian man would leave a poor woman out on the street without anything? Not the man his father raised. But you need to tell her, Eleanor told him, squeezing his hand. Because Madison has been around people who didn't treat her like a girl ought to be treated, and she's terrified. Come back with me right now, and we'll reassure her. You haven't looked her in the face in days, boy. Is it really surprising she's terrified? Caleb felt ashamed, suddenly feeling small and unworthy. He should have gotten over it sooner. He hadn't meant to frighten Madison. Now, he was angry that she had been treated badly in the past. Why hadn't she told him that? They'd shared so many things. He sighed, disgusted with himself. Madison just made him feel so much, all the time, and he shook his head, not wanting to linger there in the barn any longer. All right. We'll go see Madison, and I'll talk to her, he reassured his mother. Maybe I shouldn't have ignored her for so long. He didn't tell his mother everything, though. He didn't tell her about his fears regarding Rufus Cobalt. Those thoughts were best kept to himself. He quickly finished his lunch and the two of them walked back to the house, enjoying the sun. Walking with his mother did raise Caleb's spirits, and he felt better when they stepped inside his home. He prayed his conversation with Madison would go well, that she would understand that he'd needed time to think everything through. But the house was empty. Madison? Eleanor called, then put her hands on her hips, annoyed. That girl. I told her she only had to do the chores inside the house. Maybe she's in the bedrooms. But we already washed the sheets not so long ago. Where could she be? Caleb muttered. He had a bad feeling. He looked around the house with narrowed eyes, tense, his hands closed into fists. It occurred to him that with Lucas still out traveling, and Caleb with his mother in the barn, Madison had been alone inside the house. Dread pulled in his gut. I think, he started, apprehensive, and his mouth snapped shut when his eyes zeroed in on a piece of paper thrown on the floor of the kitchen. Ma! Come here. Eleanor rushed to his side quickly, and they read the note together. As Caleb's eyes flew over the words, his knuckles turned white around the paper, crinkling it up until it ripped in his grasp. Guess who this is, Shaw? Meet us on the road by the state border. Your woman's life is in your hands. If you don't come, I'll kill her. You might get her back if you win the duel. Rufus Cobalt. Oh, no, Eleanor said, her voice full of horror. It's that slime Rufus Cobalt. I knew he had been around, Caleb said darkly. I was so stupid. How could I have left Madison alone in the house? It's my fault she was taken. Oh, Caleb, Eleanor cried, tears in her eyes. She buried her face in his shoulder. What are we gonna do? What will that man do to her? Rufus wasn't going to do anything to her, and Caleb was going to get Madison back. Chapter 10. This is all my fault, Eleanor said as she wept. She had her hands covering her face and was trembling fiercely. Caleb touched her shoulder lightly. Stop. I'll get her back. Don't worry. He didn't say more, his mind was spinning as he thought about what he needed to do. He was also working on hiding his own fury and fear, lest he upset his mother even more. None of this is your fault, Ma, he finally said, lacing up his boots. I brought her here, Eleanor wailed. I tricked her into coming to this house, and now what will happen to her? You won't marry her, and now this man will kill her. He won't, Caleb snapped. He won't lay a single finger on her. I won't let him. Men like him are nothing. There's a reason I was risking my life going after scum like him. He gripped his gun tightly, willing his hands not to shake. The truth was that he knew Rufus was just toying with him. There was no way Caleb was walking into a fair duel. Rufus had set a trap, and Caleb was walking right into it because he couldn't not go. He couldn't not go after Madison. He loved her. The realization hit him like a train to the chest. His gun almost slipped from his hand, but he caught it before it could fall. It was the truth, and he couldn't escape it. He loved Madison. She was beautiful and kind, she understood him, and they liked the same things. The fact that he had put her in danger made him want to do something drastic. Why had he left her alone? Why had he ever left her side? She had come here to marry him. The thought filled his chest with a warm, desperate feeling he couldn't name. Suddenly, Caleb remembered Anton in those last few moments they had together, and the promise he had made him. He had promised Anton he would settle down, that he would find someone. Madison had literally fallen into his life, and he had been stupid enough to push her away. He really was a fool. But no more. Caleb would find her and bring her home, and they would never be separated again. He loaded up his gun and picked up his hat. I'll be back soon, he told his mother, and kissed her forehead. She gripped his wrist tightly, afraid, but let him go. With Madison, he added before disappearing. The road where they were meeting was far from the town and nearby farms, and was basically deserted. That was good. Caleb didn't want to involve the townspeople or the sheriff in what was going on between him and Rufus. This was personal. It had been personal ever since Anton was killed. Here, there was less of a chance that random people would get hurt. Madison getting caught up with this was dangerous enough. As he rode the path that Rufus himself probably had ridden, he noticed spots of blood. His heart stopped in his chest. Could it be Madison's? Could Rufus have done something to her already? Caleb feared the worst. If Rufus had already killed her, there was nothing Caleb could do. He rode faster, kicking into the sides of his horse and willing it to run as fast as possible. It felt like it took forever for him to reach the right spot, but Caleb soon arrived at his destination. It was hard to miss Rufus, where he stood in the middle of the packed earth amidst the small bushes. Caleb looked wildly around, though he was hesitant to look away from the outlaw in front of him. He couldn't see Madison anywhere. There were some bigger rocks and scraggly trees around, but he couldn't see if there was anything behind them. Mr. Shaw, Rufus greeted mockingly. Caleb dismounted his horse, his hand on his gun. Where's Madison? He asked, his voice hard. He wasn't in the mood for playing. Rufus laughed, throwing his head back and showing the gap from his missing teeth. It was a mocking laugh, and Caleb kept his dread from creeping into his face. Rufus couldn't have hurt Madison already. She couldn't be dead. He reminded himself a bit desperately that Rufus was a cruel man, and he wouldn't have spared himself the joy of making Caleb suffer further. Did you really think we'd duel? Rufus asked with a sneer. It's an eye for an eye, you fool. You killed my brothers, and now. Woman, come here. Caleb felt relief wash over him like a bucket of clear river water when Madison stumbled from behind a rock and onto the road. She looked terrified and disoriented, and crusted blood had dripped heavily from her head, but Caleb couldn't feel anything but relief. He sent a prayer to God. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Rufus grabbed her by the arm and dragged her harshly to his side, cutting off her sobbing. Caleb was going to kill this man for doing this to her, and then make sure she never had reason to cry again. I'm going to shoot your wife, Rufus drawled, an undercurrent of pure poison in his voice, and you're going to sit there and watch. Caleb shouted. He lifted his gun, his shoulder wound screaming, but he ignored it. He aimed, and a shot rang out. Caleb's blood went cold. He hadn't squeezed the trigger. Rufus screamed and fell to the ground, bleeding from his thigh. Caleb stared in shock. Rufus hadn't shot Madison. He had been shot. Caleb raced forward, kicked Rufus's gun from his hand, and grabbed the rope from his belt. He tied him up before he could move. Rufus was still hollering, letting out a string of curses. Caleb resisted the urge to punch him where he lay, his hands trembling, terror still coursing through his veins. Madison put a hand on her head, fingering her wound, woozy, and fell to her knees beside Caleb, mindless of the hard ground hurting her knees. She threw her arms around Caleb's neck and sobbed. Caleb was here. He had come for her. That man wasn't going to hurt her anymore. When Caleb put his arms around her and drew her to his chest, she sobbed, her body shaking. She buried her face in his shoulder without caring that she could taint his clothes with her blood. Caleb, she wept. You came, you're here. He rubbed his firm, rough hands on her back, soothing her, but he was craning his neck, looking around. A man appeared from behind the scraggly trees around them. Madison went stiff, tense and wary, from around the curve of Caleb's body. Caleb had seen him, too. You're familiar, he said. The other man nodded in greeting. He was holding a gun, and then Madison knew it was he who shot Rufus. Caleb stood, lifting Madison along with him. She clung to him, and his hand clutched the back of her waist like he never wanted to let her go. Frank, the man said. We met before. In the saloon. I've been trailing Rufus for a while now, ever since he murdered my people. He looked down at Rufus, writhing on the ground where Caleb had left him tied, and spit on him. Rufus snarled back like a wild animal, but there was nothing he could do. If it weren't for you, I think we'd both be dead, Caleb told him. Thank you. If it weren't for you, I'd never have gotten him, Frank countered with a sharp shake of his head. He reached out with a hand, and Caleb took it in a firm handshake. Besides, if you hadn't been quick as a bullet and tied him up like you did, he'd have killed us all. And without you, I'd never have gotten him at all. So, thank you. Frank looked again at Rufus and kicked him in the leg. Rufus howled. Then Frank spoke again to Caleb. I'll take over from here. You take your missus home. I'm obliged, Caleb said. Thank you, again. Madison buried her face back in Caleb's shoulder, not interested in the stranger any longer. After everything that had happened, she'd been so afraid Caleb wouldn't come for her, not after the way he'd acted when he found out about her deceit, but that thought was far away now. Caleb was right there, holding her close in his arms, and she finally felt safe. He had risked his life to try and get her back. He had done it all for her. Madison, Caleb said softly, close to her ear, and Madison shivered. Let's go home, shall we? And we need to get that head of yours looked at. She nodded, and he helped her up onto his horse. He rode with her in front of him. She leaned back against his chest, cradled in the warm space of his body. Chapter 11. Madison couldn't stop shaking. As soon as the horse approached the ranch, she could see Eleanor's relieved figure on the porch, waiting for them, wringing her hands. Caleb helped her down and Eleanor wrapped her up in an embrace so warm and tight that Madison thought she knew now what a mother's hug felt like. After all this time, the house had become her home. It seemed strange, now, to think about how much she had wanted to leave in the beginning. Eleanor led her into the house and sat her down on a settee, keeping an arm around her waist. Caleb, who hadn't left her side yet and refused to do so now, sat down beside her, their bodies touching from shoulders to knees. Madison leaned against him, soaking up his warmth and steadiness. In a strange turn of events, Eleanor sent for a nurse to help Madison with her wounds and her trauma. Madison chuckled. The nurse, a real nurse, was old and kind, and she wiped the blood carefully away from Madison's face and washed it from her hair. It had all come from a small wound on her scalp when Rufus had hit her for not hiding fast enough. The nurse said head wounds bleed a lot, that it was normal, and Madison would be just fine after some rest and a good meal. Madison trembled. Caleb wound an arm around her shoulders, somehow bringing them even closer. I am so sorry for putting you in this situation, Eleanor told her, her voice low with shame. All of this started with me. I should never have sent you those letters, or made you stay after you told me you wanted to leave. I should never have brought you here. But I'm glad you did, Madison said, her voice firmer than she thought possible at that moment. It was the truth. She had been terrified, but Caleb had come for her. God was wise, and everything that had happened for a reason. Madison could barely remember her sad, lonely life back at the orphanage. She had found happiness here, happiness with Caleb and his mother. I'm glad I came here, she told them truthfully and managed to smile. Caleb smiled back. I was afraid, he admitted, his voice low. But I'm glad, too. Madison, I won't let something like this happen to you ever again. She believed him. The nurse left soon after. Night fell, and Eleanor retired to bed. Caleb felt tired and weary after what felt like the longest day of his life, but he still had Madison under his arm, and he wouldn't leave for as long as she allowed him by her side. She had her head on his shoulder, she was the loveliest thing he had ever seen. Madison, Caleb whispered, and she lifted her head. He caught her hand in his and brought her fingers to his lips. She smiled and blushed. He lowered her hand to kiss her properly, tilting his head down until their noses bumped, and Madison laughed. It was a bit clumsy, a bit shaky, but it was the best kiss he had ever had. I've been treating you like no man should treat a woman, he told her, apologetic. I'm sorry, Madison. Ma said you were afraid I'd throw you out. I'd never, ever do that. Because no good man would ever do that, but I also wouldn't never want you out of this house, Madison. I love you. Her smile was like the rising sun, and he was awed by how beautiful it was. By how beautiful she was. Oh, Caleb, she said, her voice thick with tears. I never thought you, well, I lied to you. I wouldn't have thought you were wrong to kick me out. What reason could I have to stay here? I had no right to demand anything. I'd come here thinking I'd be married not a week later, but when I found out the truth, well, I could have told you the truth about it all. I know you. Madison. I know your heart. He paused. Rufus called you my wife. She flushed harder, dropping her gaze and biting her lip. He cupped her chin with one hand and lifted her gaze to his again. Will you be my wife? He asked her softly. She started to cry, wrapping her own fingers around his. Yes, she said. Yes, of course. Oh, Caleb. I never thought I'd be so lucky. I think today is the happiest day of my life. Caleb kissed her again and ran his hand through her golden hair. I'll work hard to be the best husband I can be, he promised. Epilogue. After washing the dishes, Eleanor wiped the kitchen counters and felt decidedly smug. It had all been God's plan, of course, as all things were, but she couldn't deny her own hand in it. She'd felt sorrow that she had brought such disaster to Madison and her son, but now, she felt satisfied. Everything always did work out in the end. The two had been married 3 weeks previously at this very ranch, and now they were dancing and laughing together in her living room. She had never seen her son smile so wildly, and her dreams of grandchildren running around these rooms was closer to being true than she'd ever thought possible. It wouldn't take long with a love like theirs, she knew. Maybe we can talk to the Johnsons about borrowing their kitchen, Eleanor mused. This grand party I've planned is growing bigger than I anticipated. The sad truth is that our kitchen is just not big enough to cook for so many people. You shouldn't have invited the whole city, Caleb said. I want everyone to come, Eleanor insisted. I want them all to meet your new wife, since the wedding was so small and private. This is going to be fun. Perhaps the Johnsons could bring their own food? Madison suggested with a wide grin while Caleb twirled her around, no doubt trying to distract her from her conversation with Eleanor. If everyone brought something, we wouldn't have so much work to do. Eleanor scoffed. Daughter-in-law, no guest of mine is going to eat their own food in my house. Organizing this party is going to be quite a task, Madison told her. But I suppose I don't want anyone in town to think I'm less than a good wife. You are, Caleb said, besotted, the best wife in the world. I won't let anybody say otherwise, no matter who serves what food in whose house. Maybe Eleanor would get tired of the love talk soon, but she definitely hadn't yet. And you are the best husband, Madison told Caleb, her voice soft. Maybe you could bring your friends as well. It's supposed to be an event for us, after all, not only me, even though it's intended to introduce me to all the people of this town. What friends? Eleanor muttered. Even though he was married and happier, Caleb still didn't like going to town and socializing. Eleanor supposed that a mother couldn't fix everything at once. She chuckled at such a silly thought. Perhaps once you have children, Caleb will have something to talk about with the other fathers, Eleanor suggested innocently. Ma, Caleb complained. Madison blushed. I hope we have a baby soon. Would you like that, Caleb? Being a father? Caleb rubbed his hand over her cheek affectionately. If they have your eyes, he murmured. Ah, young love, Eleanor sighed. Caleb rode on his chestnut-colored horse, while Madison rode on her pure white mare. After their wedding, they had started the habit of riding together a few times a week. Their fondness for horses had grown tenfold since their first days of acquaintance, particularly since their love of horses was the first thing that had brought them together. The sun was shining high in the sky and perspiration dripped down Caleb's forehead. He led Madison out of the ranch and onto the road. Ranch life was hard, there was no denying that, but now with Madison by his side, it was different. Everything was different. Caleb only wished Anton could have met her. He thought about his mentor and dear friend. Anton would have liked her. What's got you looking so far away? His wife softly asked him as they stopped their horses and prepared to turn back toward the ranch. I've never seen you so quiet. Caleb swallowed, looking down. Madison, he said, I know we're not sure if you're having a baby yet or not, but if we have a boy, could we name him Anton? Madison's expression softened. Madison smiled, it was a kind, gentle smile. Caleb looked at her and thought he was the luckiest man in the world. Of course, she said. Anton, for your dear friend. And Eleanor, if it's a girl. That's so nice. Ma would love that. But what about Madison Jr.? Caleb joked, his face breaking into a smile. Caleb, don't be silly. No one names their daughters like that. They laughed together and rode back home. The end. Thank you for listening to this heartwarming story by Susannah Calloway. You can be assured that all her books are clean and wholesome. To find other romances by Susannah Calloway, as well as the other authors at Tika House Publishing, visit www.tikahousepublishing.com. Remember to hit like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next Susannah Calloway Western romance.